will be paid back partially later in the form of lower growth as temporary spending incentives, notably for investment, expire, and as increasing federal debt takes a toll over time. Thirdly, as important as they have been to the recovery, easy financial conditions and fiscal support have also left a legacy of debt, government and in some cases corporate and household debt, in advanced and emerging economies alike. Inflation would tighten financial conditions globally and prompt markets to reevaluate debt sustainability in some cases. Elevated equity prices would also be vulnerable, raising the risk of disruptive asset price adjustments. Fourthly, despite rising growth in Europe, Asia, and North America, there is less good news in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, the last area weighed down by the weakness of its larger economies. Low growth, driven in part by adverse weather effects and sometimes combined with civil strife, has sparked significant outward migrations. Improvements in some large Latin American economies are notable, but aggregate growth in the region will be weighed down this year by continuing economic collapse in Venezuela. Finally and fifthly, even though the recovery has lifted employment and aggregate income from crisis lows, voters in many advanced economies have soured on political establishments, doubting their ability to deliver broadly shared growth in the face of tepid real wage gains, reduced labor shares in national income, and rising job polarization. A turn to more nationalistic or authoritarian governance models, however, could result in stalled economic reforms at home and a withdrawal from cross-border economic integration. Both developments would harm longer-term growth prospects to the detriment of those who have already fallen behind over the past few decades. Levels of inequality are high in emerging markets and low-income economies as well, and there too carry the seeds of eventual future disruptions unless growth can be made more inclusive. This situation creates challenges for policymakers. Perhaps the overarching risk at the moment is complacency. While the current conjuncture might appear to be a sweet spot for the global economy, prudent policymakers must look beyond the near term. No matter how tempting it is to sit back and enjoy the sunshine, policy can and should move to strengthen this recovery. Now is the time to build policy buffers, reinforce defenses against financial instability, and invest in structural reforms, productive infrastructure, and people. And I stress the people. The next recession may be closer than we think, and the ammunition with which to combat it is much more limited than a decade ago, notably because public debts are also much higher. An upswing so broad also furnishes an ideal moment to act on a range of multilateral challenges. These include countering global financial stability threats, including cyber threats, strengthening the multilateral trading system, cooperating on international tax policy, including the fight against money laundering, and promoting sustainable development in low-income economies. Of especially urgent importance is to fight irreversible environmental damage, notably from climate change. With that, I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Well, thank you very much, Maury.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Madame Lagarde. We'll now turn to your questions in the room. Just to mention, you have the WEO update, the document. We will release Maury's remarks to you. We're doing that now. And we will release Madame Lagarde's remarks to you as well. So we have a large audience here in the room. We have a very large audience online. And we'll turn to your questions if you could keep them as short as possible. And please identify yourself by name and affiliation. Thank you. Let's start here with Bloomberg. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enda Curran from Bloomberg News. I wonder, you mentioned that the overarching risk is complacency. And you mentioned we might be closer to a recession than we think.
Yeah. It's hard to identify one risk as the biggest, because I think all are quite worrisome, and they also interact. And so I think policymakers really need to think broadly, comprehensively, and for the long term, not just over the next political cycle, which is sometimes hard for them. As an example, I flagged the lower long-term growth rates. These are part and parcel of the sort of political dissatisfaction I think we've been seeing in many economies, particularly as the fruits of growth have been quite unequally distributed, and in some countries increasingly so. Financial stability, how we regulate the financial sector, is also not disconnected with concerns about inequality. I think pushing on one priority would probably do a disservice to the challenge that policymakers face. They really need a broad approach, one that is very comprehensive.
Thank you. Okay, just maybe taking the lady in the second row here. Second row, thank you.
Alicia González from El País. You mentioned specifically Spain in the report, and you reduced the perspectives for this year because of political uncertainty, but you raise it for next year. So must I assume that you believe the political uncertainty will finish, or that we will have any other stimulus of any kind? Thank you.
Yeah, well, we're certainly hopeful that the political situation and the uncertainty that it causes will diminish, and that while this is an internal matter for Spain, that within the laws of the country, some way to move forward will be reached. For the current year's forecast, we did do a downgrade. Now, this reflects some uncertainty from the Catalonia situation, coupled with some optimism, because there is growth in the Eurozone, and this will benefit Spain. And we expect that momentum to carry over into 2019. Spain is now benefiting. The growth has been above 3% for several years now. It's benefiting from past reforms. We think that pace is not quite sustainable, but we do see healthy growth for the next couple of years. I don't know if Gian Maria wants to add to that, or...
No, I would just mention that the external environment is clearly helpful, because we are forecasting a strong recovery in the euro area, including for 2019. So that supports Spanish exports.
Thank you very much. Okay, just moving around. Lady in the third row. Yes, ma'am.
Sandra from Tencent. Two questions. First of all, China actually has been the growth engine during the 2008 financial crisis. Right now, it has been 10 years from there, and you just mentioned China goes through its rebalancing process. So what role China plays right now comparing to 10 years ago? And the second one is, let's say in this year, let's say if Fed will raise rates the same pace as last year, do you worry it's going to have more pressure on the emerging market? Thank you.
Yeah. China, of course, carried out a very large fiscal stimulus at the time of the crisis. This was a strong support not only for Chinese growth, but for global growth. And even though China's growth rate has come down, given its size in the world economy, given its relatively high growth rate, it is still a major source of growth. There are certainly challenges which the leadership has recognized in terms of strengthening further financial regulation, strengthening further hard budget constraints on state-owned enterprises, strengthening the relationship between local and federal budgets. So there are challenges there, but we see China as a strong driver of global growth going forward. As far as the Fed is concerned, we will expect them to look at the situation in the U.S. and make data-dependent decisions to attain their mandate, which is full employment, stable prices. I think the communication over the last couple of years has been particularly good. The adjustment has been gradual. This has not overly stressed the emerging markets, and our baseline would be for that to continue.
Thank you. Okay, just swinging around. In the front row, gentlemen.
Hi. Quite a lot of the last little while... Sorry, my name's Alec Hogg from biznews.com. Quite a lot of the last little while is to do with geopolitics. We've seen Southern Africa, some dramatic changes in the political situation there. Are you reading, like Goldman Sachs does, which in the weekend said that South Africa is their top emerging market for 2018? Have you worked any of that into your calculations?
Yeah, I mean, basically, these update numbers predate the, what has been going on in South Africa, these very recent developments, and so we will have more of that in our spring numbers when we issue the World Economic Outlook. But we have not, fully incorporated those very recent developments.
A general comment on what's going on there.
I think we have to wait and see how this works out.
Okay, lady in the front row, too.
Thank you. Ivana Gutosova, CNN. You mentioned the tax policies in the US will have impact on growth globally, attributing about half of that upgrade to the tax policies. Do you expect the same to happen after 2022? Is the US growth going to become a drag on the global growth because of the tax policies and the slowdown that you expect there?
Yeah, well, we don't, I should preface this by saying that the tax bill and its impact is quite complex, and there's a lot of uncertainty around our estimates. Given that some of the features of the tax bill are explicitly temporary, we do expect there to be some payback. For example, temporary expensing of investment should give a surge of investment in the near term, but when that stops, there will be some payback of that. On the other hand, some of the features, the cut in corporate tax, the move to a territorial system, are not temporary. We also incorporate in our forecast the pay-go provisions, which would require cuts in government expenditure going forward as the deficit grows. Hard to say whether those will be adhered to or relaxed. So there's certainly some potential for the payback in U.S. growth to result in slower import growth in the U.S., which would affect trading partners. That's somewhat symmetric with what's happening in the current years, but how big those effects would be, how the overall picture would look is very hard to predict.
Thank you, Mark. Probably time for a couple more. Gentleman in the second row here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. It's Stephen Fiddler from the Wall Street Journal. When you talk about repairing the roof, are you also suggesting